Chapter 5, Back on This Side of the Door. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out, "Peter! Susan! It's all true! Edmund has been in too! There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe! Edmund and I both got in! We met one another there in the wood. Go on, Edmund! Tell them all about it!" "What's all this about, Ed?" said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in the story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year's difference. And then a little snigger and said, "Oh yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that her story about a country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success, and went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst with young kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up! You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe. And now you go playing games with her and setting her off again? I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to either be going queer in the head or turning into the most frightful liar. Whatever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging her one day and encouraging her the next?" I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "You didn't think at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now." "Do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make things any better to have a row between you two. Let's go and find Lucy." It was not surprising that when they found Lucy a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, "I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I had stayed there, and you are all beasts, just beasts." It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage, talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was the next morning they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. "He'll write to Father if he thinks there's really something wrong with Lou," said Peter. "It's getting beyond us." So they went and knocked at the study door, and the professor said, "Come in." They got up and found chairs for them and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting till they had finished the whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" But," began Susan and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said they had only been pretending." "That's the point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you'll excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the most reliable? I mean, which is the more truthful?" "Well, that's just the funny thing about it, sir," said Peter. "Up until now, I would have said Lucy every time." "And what do you think, my dear?" said the professor, turning to Susan. Well, said Susan, in general I'd say the same as Peter, but this couldn't be true. All that she said about the wood and the fawn, that is more than I know, said the professor. And a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found to be truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed. We were afraid it might not be lying, said Susan. We were afraid there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean, said the professor quite coolly. Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One only has to look at her and talk to her to see that she is not mad. But then, said Susan, and then stopped. She never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it's obvious that she is not mad. For the moment, then, and unless further evidence turns up, we must assume she is telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? Said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor, and Peter did not know quite what to say. But there was no time, said Susan. Lucy had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running up to us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been gone away for hours. That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you, this is a very strange house, and even I know very little of it. If, I say, she had gotten into another world, I should not at all be surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would not take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable amount of time before coming out and telling her story. But do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds? All over the place? Just round the corner? Just like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them while he muttered to himself, I wonder what they do teach at these schools. But what are we to do? Said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression, both of them. There is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and which is well worth trying. Well, what's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, said he. And that was the end of the conversation. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject, and so for a time it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see it. It was the sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in histories, and well it might be, for all manners of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the ones that I am telling you now. And when parties and sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them round, telling them about pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children, and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost on the first morning, along with a good many other instructions, and please remember you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party around the house. Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing round with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other 3 thought the same. This was how the adventures began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits. Then the other girls rushed into the rooms and said, "Look out! Here comes the MacCready and a whole gang with her!" "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and all four made off through the door at the far end of the room. And when they had gotten out into the green room and beyond it, into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them and realized that Mrs. MacCready must be bringing her party of sightseers up to the back stairs instead of the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads, or that Mrs. MacCready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, until Susan said at last, "Oh, bother these trippers! Here, let's get into the wardrobe room till they've passed. No one will follow us in there." But the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage, and then someone fumbling at the door. And then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else," and flung open the wardrobe. All four of them bundled inside and sat there, panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it, for of course he remembered, as every sensible person does, you should never, never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. And that's the end of chapter 5. The kindly old professor turns out to be a big surprise to the children, mostly because he takes Lucy's claims very seriously, whereas the other children assume that an impossible sounding story must be impossible. The professor, on the other hand, wants to lay out all the facts as he can find them, and then try to make the best judgment possible based not on what he assumes, but what the facts really state. So he's asking who's the most truthful, and he's examining her to see if he thinks that she's crazy or not. And he is left with a conclusion, though, which seems impossible to the children, is actually far more possible than what its alternatives might be. And interestingly enough, C.S. Lewis finds a way to include one of his most famous theological statements. He writes about it in several of his works. This is a guy who, though raised in a Christian home, lost his faith at an early age as he lost his mother to illness. It wasn't until he was a young man there in university with other friends who happened to be deeply faithful Christians, folks like J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, who presented to him the fundamental truth of faith in God, the reasonableness of who Jesus is, and that faith was reignited back within C.S. Lewis. And one of the ways that he presents the reasonableness and the faith in Christ is what's sometimes referred to as the liar, lunatic, or Lord options. And he really gives them here talking about Lucy. He says either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. He presents this in other books in talking about Jesus, where people who want to keep Christ at arm's length, but like the idea of someone who taught some of the things that Jesus did, will say, well, I like Jesus as a great moral teacher. And C.S. Lewis would push back on that to say, well, if what you're going by is the Gospels, this is where you're seeing his great moral teachings, then I don't think you're left with that option of being just a great moral teacher. For Jesus himself made claims about who he was, about what that meant, about what he was to do, and why. And so, being a great moral teacher, but then accepting worship, saying that you are the Son of God, believing and telling others that you would be dying for their sins and being raised again to defeat death itself, well, it seems to me that if you're a great moral teacher teaching all of those things, then your morals are actually pretty bad. So instead, Lewis says, if you take Jesus at his word, then you need to be left with the fact that he's either lying, maliciously, terribly, frequently, or that he's a crazy person. He's the sort of delusional person who assumes that they're a celebrity or a famous historical figure. Or he said, if you take Jesus at his word, you don't think that he's lying, you don't see anything that makes you assume that he's crazy, then you need to be open to believing that he is precisely who he says he is. He is the King of Kings, and he is the Lord of Lords. And even in this simple story, one we might assume is just for kids, there is something to challenge each of us at any age. What do we assume? What do we know? Who do we trust? And then ultimately that trust can't be put in any better place than the same person who said, I am the way and the truth and the life.